The black town car pulled up to the Hargrove estate at 2:15 on a Saturday in October, and the moment the door opened, the garden went quiet, not gradually, all at once. Conrad Ellison stepped out, wearing a charcoal suit that had been pressed but not tailored, the kind a man buys once and keeps for decades because he sees no reason to replace what still works. He was 53 years old, gray at the temples, with the unhurried posture of someone who had never needed a room to notice him. Behind him, 2 men in dark jackets stepped out of a second vehicle, then 2 more from a third. They did not fan out dramatically. They simply existed around him, the way weight exists around a structure that knows how to carry it. At the far end of the garden, where white linen tables had been arranged beneath strings of October light, a woman in a cream blazer set down her champagne flute and did not pick it back up. Her name was Sandra Hargrove, and 3 weeks earlier she had mailed Conrad Ellison an invitation to her retirement celebration, with a handwritten note tucked inside that read, "I want you to see what a career looks like when it doesn't give up halfway." She had not signed it. She had not needed to. Conrad Ellison had spent the last 22 years in a building most people drove past without looking at. It sat on the industrial edge of Hamilton, Ontario, between a fleet depot and a sheet metal supplier, and the sign above the door read Ellison Fabrication in letters that had faded to the color of old bone. He drove himself to work in a 2009 Silverado with a cracked passenger mirror that he kept meaning to replace. He ate lunch at his desk most days. He owned one good watch, inherited from his father, and he wore it only when the occasion required it. The occasion had required it today. 22 years ago, none of that had existed yet. He had been 31 and newly hired as a junior procurement analyst at Hargrove Industrial Supply, a mid-size firm out of Burlington that sourced components for manufacturing clients across southern Ontario. It was not a glamorous position. It was the kind of job a careful man takes because it is solid, because it teaches you the interior architecture of an industry, because you understand that the foundation matters more than the facade. Sandra Hargrove had been his direct supervisor. She was 40 at the time, precise and socially fluent in the way of people who had grown up watching their parents work a room. She had a talent for identifying potential in other people, and an equally sharp talent for deciding whose potential was worth cultivating. She had decided, about 8 months into Conrad's time at the firm, that his was not. The conversation happened on a Tuesday afternoon in the small conference room that overlooked the parking lot. Sandra had prepared for it the way she prepared for everything, with a folder on the table and a particular quality of stillness that meant she had already decided what she was going to say before she sat down. She told him, in measured and reasonable language, that the company was restructuring its junior analyst positions and that his role was among those being eliminated. She told him that he had a strong eye for detail, but that the firm needed people who could move faster, think bigger, who could see the industry from a broader altitude than the one he seemed comfortable at. She used the phrase comfortable altitude twice. Conrad had asked one question. He had asked whether the decision was performance-based or structural. Sandra had paused for precisely long enough that the answer became unnecessary. He cleaned out his desk that afternoon. He did not argue. He did not request a review. He drove home in the rain and sat in his kitchen for a long time with a cup of tea that went cold in front of him, and he thought about what Sandra had said and whether she was right. He concluded that she was wrong about him, but correct about one thing. He did not belong at her company. He had never belonged there. He had been trying to learn an industry, not build a career inside someone else's structure. The difference, he understood sitting in that kitchen, was significant. He started Ellison Fabrication 14 months later in a leased unit, the size of a double garage with 2 employees, a second-hand lathe, and a contract to supply custom brackets to a local HVAC installer. By the end of the 3rd year, he had 12 employees and 3 contracts. By the end of the 10th, he had 61 employees, a second facility in Brantford, and supply relationships with 4 of the largest manufacturing groups in Ontario. He did not celebrate any of these milestones publicly. He noted them in a project ledger he kept on his desk and then went back to work. He did not think about Sandra Hargrove, not because the memory of that Tuesday afternoon was painless, but because he had made a decision, sometime around the 4th year, to let the work be its own answer to questions he no longer needed to ask out loud. The invitation arrived on a Thursday morning in September, brought in by his office manager, Pauline, along with the rest of the week's correspondence. Conrad recognized the Hargrove Company letterhead before he recognized the handwriting. He turned the envelope over, opened it with the same flat attention he gave to supplier contracts, and read the card. Hargrove Industrial Supply cordially invited him to celebrate the retirement of Sandra Hargrove, 31 years of leadership and vision. The Hargrove Estate, Ancaster, October 15th. Cocktails at 1, dinner at 5. He read the handwritten note that had been tucked beneath the card. He read it twice. He set both pieces of paper on his desk and rested his hand flat on them, not pressing, just resting, the way a man rests his hand on something he is deciding what to do with. Pauline came back 20 minutes later with a revised shipping schedule that needed his signature. She had worked for Conrad for 11 years. She noticed the envelope, the stillness, and the particular quality of his expression that she had learned to recognize as a man who was not troubled but was deciding something. She set the schedule on the corner of the desk and waited. "Old supervisor," he said, without being asked. "She wants me to come watch her retirement party." Pauline looked at the Hargrove letterhead and said nothing for a moment. Then, "And?" She included a note. He turned the smaller paper around on the desk so she could read it. Pauline read it. She set it back without commenting on the language. "Are you going?" Conrad stood up and walked to the window. The yard below was active, the second shift, loading a flatbed for a morning run to Guelph. He watched a forklift navigate the turn between two stacked pallets with the efficiency that comes from doing something so many times it becomes instinct. "She let me go 22 years ago," he said, and then spent the years after that explaining to people in this industry why. "I've heard the version she tells. I've had 2 suppliers mention it at trade shows. I've had a potential hire tell me during an interview that he'd heard I burned out early in my career and never recovered." He turned from the window. "She built a story, and she sent me an invitation to come stand inside it on the day she's celebrating herself." Pauline said, "So don't go." She sent it on purpose. His voice was even. She picked the paper. She wrote the note by hand. "She wants me in that garden so that the people who have heard her version of things for 20 years can see me there. The man who couldn't reach the altitude she required, watching her take her bow." He picked up the invitation and held it for a moment. "I'm going to go. Once. And then I'm done with all of it." Pauline was quiet for a moment. "How do you want to show up?" Conrad thought about this. Not with performance, not with noise, with exactly the weight of what was true, visible to anyone who knew what to look for. "Call Darren at the Burlington office," he said. "Tell him I need 3 vehicles on the 15th. Tell him I'd like him there personally." He paused. "And tell him this is not a security situation. I want him to understand that. I'm not going there to make trouble. I'm going there to finish something that should have been finished a long time ago." He sat back down at his desk. He opened the project ledger to a clean page and wrote down one date in small, deliberate handwriting. Then he closed it and set it beside the keyboard where it always sat. Outside, the forklift completed its turn. Sandra Hargrove spent the morning of October 15th in the main sitting room of the estate with her daughter, Melissa, and 2 women from the firm who had organized the event. The Hargrove estate had been in the family for 30 years, a restored Victorian property on 12 acres outside Ancaster that Sandra had always preferred for gatherings over restaurants or hotels because it gave her full control of the setting. She liked full control of the setting. Melissa adjusted the collar of her mother's blazer and said, "You look exactly right." "I always look exactly right," Sandra said, not unkindly. It was simply accurate. By noon, the garden had filled with 140 guests. Former colleagues, current board members, 3 city councilors, a provincial trade representative, and the kind of business contacts who attend events like this, because being seen attending is itself a form of currency. Sandra moved through them with the ease of a woman who had been doing exactly this for 3 decades and found it genuinely pleasurable. Just before 2 o'clock, her former deputy, a compact and careful man named Roy Stanton, appeared at her elbow with a glass of sparkling water and a particular expression. "Sandra," he said, "there are vehicles coming up the drive. There are always vehicles on the drive, Roy. 3 of them, black, moving in a formation that doesn't look like catering." Sandra turned toward the front of the estate with the unhurried confidence of a woman who had managed every room she'd ever walked into. She watched the first vehicle slow to a stop, then the second, then the third. She watched the doors open in sequence. She did not recognize Conrad at first. That was the thing she would not be able to account for afterward. She had pictured him so many times in the version she carried that the actual man arriving on her property did not initially resolve into the person she had let go 22 years earlier. He was older, yes, but it was not the age that was disorienting. It was the way he moved. He walked up the garden path the way a man walks through a building he owns. Not aggressively, without hurry, without the particular quality of contained apology that she remembered in his posture from his time at the firm. The men around him moved with a professional attentiveness that Sandra recognized immediately, because the firm had hired that kind of professional attentiveness for 3 industry events in the past decade, and she knew what it cost. Roy said quietly, "Is that?" "Yes," Sandra said. Guests near the front of the garden had already turned. The low register of polite conversation shifted without stopping entirely, the way a current changes direction beneath a surface that still looks smooth. An older man in a navy blazer near the water feature took 2 steps forward, studied the approaching figure, and said to the woman beside him in a voice that carried, "That's Conrad Ellison." His companion turned. "Ellison Fabrication? Supplies half the floor manufacturing base in the Golden Horseshoe. That's him." A man 2 rows back said, "He's here?" A woman beside him, "I didn't know he and Sandra." "Neither did I." The current moved forward through the garden. By the time Conrad had reached the midpoint of the flagstone path, the conversation at the nearest tables had stopped. By the time Darren and the others had settled into their quiet positions, 2 of the city councilors had stood up from their chairs. Sandra did not move to greet him. She stayed where she was and waited, which she recognized with a precision she did not enjoy, was the same thing she had done 22 years ago in the conference room that overlooked the parking lot. She had always made people come to her. Conrad stopped 10 feet from her. He did not look at the crowd. He looked at her with the same flat, attentive expression she remembered from that Tuesday afternoon, and it occurred to her, with a clarity she found unwelcome, that he had never looked frightened of her. Not then, and not now. "Conrad," she said. Her voice was exactly right. She had 30 years of practice. "I didn't know if you'd come." "You knew," he said, not unkindly. Simply accurately, Roy stepped back without being asked. Melissa, who had come out of the estate's side entrance to see what the shift in noise meant, stopped where she was at the edge of the garden. You sent the note on purpose," Conrad said. "You chose the wording carefully. You wanted me here on this day, in this garden, as a particular kind of object in a story you've been telling for 22 years. He did not raise his voice. He was not performing for the crowd, but the crowd was very still, and stillness carries. "I'm not here to take anything from your day. I want to be clear about that. But there is something I should have said the afternoon you let me go, and I didn't, and you've spent 2 decades filling in that silence with your own version of why." Sandra's expression did not change. She was too practiced for that, but something behind it shifted, a small recalibration, the kind that happens when a person realizes the room has a different shape than the one they prepared for. "We don't need to do this here," she said. "You chose here," he said, "not me." She said nothing. "You told me I couldn't reach the altitude required," Conrad said. "You used that phrase twice, I counted at the time, and I've thought about it occasionally in the years since. Not often, but occasionally." He looked at her without heat. "I want to tell you what I actually concluded." The garden was as quiet as a garden of 140 people can be when every one of them has decided not to make a sound. "You were right that I didn't belong at your company. I've never disputed that. But you made the mistake that careful people sometimes make, which is to confuse your ceiling with someone else's. You looked at a 31-year-old man who was learning a trade, not performing one, and you decided that the learning was the limit. It wasn't. It was the preparation." He reached into his jacket pocket. "I kept a note from that afternoon, not the formal letter, you sent that to HR. A note I wrote to myself that night at my kitchen table about what I was going to do next." He held up a small folded piece of paper, worn at the crease from being in a pocket for a long time. "I don't need to read it to you. You don't need to hear what it says. But I want you to know it exists, and that I have carried it for 22 years, not as a wound but as a starting point. You gave me a starting point when you let me go. I'm not here to thank you for that, because you didn't intend it as a gift. But I'm also not here to let you narrate what it meant." He put the paper back in his pocket. "You built something real," he said, looking around the garden briefly. "And I respect the work even when I don't respect the story you told around it. That's the honest version. I hope the day is everything you wanted it to be." He held her gaze for one more second. "I'm not going to stay," he said. "That would be unkind, and I'm not here to be unkind. I came because you asked me to, and because I had one thing to say. It's been said." He turned. Darren fell in at his shoulder without a word. The others arranged themselves in the same quiet formation they had arrived in. Conrad walked back down the flagstone path toward the front of the estate, with the same unhurried pace he had walked in with, and the garden watched him go with the particular silence of people who have just understood something they were not expecting to understand. Roy Stanton said very quietly to no one in particular, "Ellison Fabrication, he built that." A woman nearby said, "From nothing." After Sandra let him go, said the man in the navy blazer, still standing near the water feature. "I heard about it years ago. Didn't put the name together until just now." Sandra stood in the center of her own retirement celebration and did not move for a long moment. Melissa came across the garden and reached her mother's arm. Sandra let herself be held there, which was unusual because Sandra Hargrove did not typically allow herself to be held anywhere. "Mum," Melissa said. "Not yet," Sandra said quietly. "Give me a minute." The vehicles cleared the front gate. The celebration continued. These things always continue because the catering has been paid for and the guests have made arrangements. And the alternative is a conversation no one wants to begin in a garden in October. Sandra returned to her rounds with the same practiced warmth she had maintained for 30 years. She laughed at the right moments and thanked people with the right words, and accepted 3 different toasts with a graciousness that her oldest colleagues found entirely familiar. But Roy noticed that she stopped telling the story she had told at every firm event for the past decade. The one about the junior analyst who had shown such promise and so little follow-through. The one that always ended with the phrase, "You have to know when to let someone go for their own good." She had told that story at 6 industry dinners in the past 3 years alone. She did not tell it that afternoon. Roy did not ask why. He had worked beside Sandra Hargrove for 19 years and had learned that some questions were better understood without asking. By 4 o'clock, the garden had thinned. The counselors left early. 2 of the board members found reasons to be elsewhere before dinner. The ones who remained kept their conversations close and brief, the way people do when a room has shifted and they haven't yet decided what to do with the shift. Melissa sat with her mother on the terrace as the caterers began quietly repositioning tables. Sandra held a cup of tea that had gone slightly cold and looked out over the property her family had owned for 30 years. "Did you know," Melissa asked, "what he'd built?" Sandra was quiet for a long moment. "I knew the company name. I'd seen it on supplier lists that came across my desk from time to time." She set the cup down. "I didn't put it together. Or perhaps I didn't let myself." Melissa didn't answer. "I wrote that note," Sandra said, "because I wanted him to see that the story had a clear ending. His and mine both." She looked at the empty flagstone path. "It didn't occur to me that he might have written a different story entirely, one that didn't need mine to make sense." She stood up, straightened her blazer, looked at the garden the way a person looks at a room they have used for a long time and are seeing for the first time as something that will one day belong to someone else. "That's the thing about people you underestimate," she said. "They do the work whether you're watching or not." She went back inside. On Monday morning, Conrad Ellison arrived at the Hamilton facility at 6:45, the same time he had arrived on most mornings for the past 2 decades. He poured coffee from the machine in the back hallway, the one that made it slightly too strong, which he had never bothered to adjust because he had never minded. He went to his office, sat down, and opened the project ledger. He turned to the page where he had written the date of Sandra's party. He looked at it for a moment. Then he turned to the next clean page and wrote down the delivery schedule for the week. Pauline came in at 8 with a contract revision from the Guelph client. "How was it?" she asked. Conrad signed the first page of the contract. It was what it needed to be. Pauline nodded and did not ask anything further, because in 11 years she had learned to recognize when a man had put something down and had no intention of picking it back up. He set the pen beside the ledger. Outside, the first shift was arriving. Trucks pulling in from the highway with the ordinary sound of an operation that knew what it was doing and had no reason to explain itself to anyone. He drank his coffee and looked at the schedule and thought about the week ahead. He did not think about Sandra Hargrove, not because the memory of that October garden would never return to him, but because it no longer required anything from him. He had carried a folded piece of paper for 22 years, not as a wound and not as a trophy, simply as a reminder of the night he had sat in a kitchen with cold tea and decided to find out what he was actually made of. He knew now. That was the whole of it. That was enough.